The Veyrath had watched the stars for 11,000 cycles, and in all that time, they had never found a species worthy of their respect. They were an ancient race, older than most civilizations in the known galaxy, and they believed with absolute certainty that their wisdom was unmatched by any other beings in existence. Their greatest achievement floated at the edge of known space, a massive station that stretched across 3,000 kilometers of cold void, filled with corridors and chambers and habitats that housed specimens from every corner of the universe. They called it the Galactic Preserve, and they considered it the most important scientific endeavor ever undertaken by any civilization. The purpose of the preserve was simple: to collect, observe, and classify every sentient species in the galaxy. The Veyrath believed that understanding other life forms was essential for the safety and advancement of all, and they had developed protocols and tests that they applied with perfect consistency to every creature they collected. Commander Ixel-7 had served the preserve for 347 cycles. They had overseen the testing of 63 different species, had written reports that determined the fate of entire worlds, had watched countless specimens live and die within the sterile walls of their habitats. They were tall even by Veyrath standards, with elongated limbs and skin that shifted colors depending on their emotional state, though that skin rarely showed anything but the pale blue of clinical detachment. On this particular day, Ixel-7 stood before the observation window of Acquisition Bay 12, watching as a transport vessel completed its docking sequence. The ship had traveled for 90 cycles to reach a small moon orbiting a gas giant in an unremarkable solar system, and now it returned with cargo that the commander found deeply uninteresting. "Another primitive," Ixel-7 said to the junior technician beside them, and the words carried the weight of boredom that came from centuries of seeing the same disappointing results over and over again. "What species this time?" "Human," the technician replied, checking the data screens that floated before their elongated fingers. "Female, approximately 32 of their solar years, found alone at a research outpost on a moon they call Europa. She appears to have been conducting scientific studies of some kind." Ixel-7 made a sound of dismissal that rattled through their throat membranes. Humans were known to the Veyrath, though only through long-distance observation probes that had monitored their world for several of their centuries. They were fragile creatures with short lifespans and bodies that seemed designed for failure, too soft, too slow, too dependent on narrow ranges of temperature and atmosphere to survive even minor environmental changes. "Initial classification?" the commander asked, though the question was merely routine. They already knew what the answer would be. "Preliminary scans suggest Tier 7, the technician answered with a note of disinterest that matched their superiors. "Minimal threat assessment, minimal intelligence markers beyond basic tool use, no significant biological adaptations worth noting. Their homeworld is unremarkable, their technology is primitive, and their species shows no signs of developing anything that might be of concern to the consortium." The commander nodded, already losing interest in the conversation. Tier 7 was the lowest classification that still qualified a species as sentient, and it meant that humans would likely be forgotten in the vast archives of the preserve within a few generations. They were not dangerous enough to warrant sterilization protocols, and not interesting enough to warrant extended study. Just another mediocre species in a galaxy full of them. But protocols demanded observation regardless of how unimportant a species seemed, and so Ixel-7 watched through the window as the extraction team brought their specimen into the processing chamber. The human was still unconscious from the sedation administered during transport, and two Veyrath technicians carried her between them with obvious ease. She weighed almost nothing compared to most specimens they collected, and her body looked impossibly delicate beneath the harsh lights of the medical bay. Her skin was a warm brown color, her hair dark and cut short in a practical style that suggested functionality over appearance, and her hands, the commander noticed with mild curiosity, bore calluses that suggested manual labor of some kind. She was a scientist on her world, the technician offered, noticing the commander's brief flicker of attention. A xenobiologist, according to the data we extracted from her facility's computers. She was studying the possibility of life in the subsurface oceans of her moon. How ironic, Ixel-7 remarked without any trace of humor. A creature that dedicates her existence to searching for alien life, now becoming the subject of alien study herself. I wonder if she appreciates the symmetry. The processing took several hours, during which the human remained sedated, while medical drones mapped every cell of her body and cognitive scanners attempted to chart the primitive architecture of her brain. The Veyrath were thorough in their examinations, recording everything from genetic sequences to neurological patterns to the precise chemical composition of her blood. When the scans were complete and the specimen was cleared for habitat placement, Ixel-7 had already returned to other duties. There were 412 species currently housed in the preserve, and a single human female ranked very low on the priority list of things requiring their attention. The habitat they had prepared for her was modest by preserve standards, a circular enclosure roughly 200 meters in diameter, with artificial sunlight programmed to match the day-night cycle of her homeworld, synthetic vegetation, designed to approximate the flora of Earth, a small pond filled with recycled water, and atmospheric controls that maintained the narrow parameters her species required for survival. Through the transparent walls of her enclosure, she would be able to see other habitats stretching into the distance, each one containing another specimen, another species, another lonely creature taken from their world and placed in this sterile prison of observation. In one nearby habitat, an insected creature with too many legs paced endlessly against its invisible barriers. In another, a gaseous being swirled in patterns that might have been communication or might have been madness. Hundreds of species, all watched, all tested, all alone. Dr. Myra Chen woke slowly, her mind swimming up from darkness like a diver rising toward the surface of a deep ocean. Her first sensation was grass beneath her fingers, cool and slightly damp, and for a disorienting moment she thought she was dreaming of Earth, of the gardens her grandmother had kept, of lazy afternoons spent reading beneath apple trees. But the smell was wrong. It was too clean, too artificial, lacking the complex organic richness of real soil and real plants. There were no insects buzzing, no birds singing, no distant sounds of traffic or machinery or other humans going about their lives. The silence was absolute in a way that natural environments never were. As her eyes opened and focused on the sky above her, she knew immediately that she was somewhere impossible. The sky was a perfect blue, the exact shade of a clear summer day on Earth, but it was flat and depthless in a way that made her stomach clench with wrongness. When she looked toward the horizon, she could see where it met walls of white that curved upward and inward like the inside of an enormous bowl. There were no clouds, no sun that she could identify as a source of the light, no variation in color or brightness from one edge of the sky to the other. She sat up slowly, her head pounding from whatever drug still lingered in her system, and she took in her surroundings with the careful attention of a scientist trained to observe and analyze. Trees that looked like trees but were not trees. Their bark was too smooth, their leaves too uniform, their branches arranged in patterns that seemed designed rather than grown. Grass that felt like grass but carried no insects, no earthworms, no microscopic life in the soil beneath. A pond that reflected the artificial sky but showed no fish swimming in its depths, no algae growing on its stones, no signs of any ecosystem beyond what had been deliberately placed. And beyond the transparent walls of her enclosure, stretching away in rows that seemed to continue forever, she could see them. Other spaces, other prisons, other beings trapped just as she was. Myra understood. With a clarity that surprised her even as it terrified her, exactly what this place was. She had spent her entire career searching the cosmos for signs of intelligent life, building sensors and writing algorithms, and staring at data that never quite resolved into proof. She had dreamed of first contact since childhood, imagined the moment when humanity would finally know they were not alone in the universe. She had never imagined it would happen like this, not as a meeting of equals, not as a grand moment of discovery, but as a collection. She was a specimen now, a sample, a creature in a cage being watched by eyes she could not see. The natural response would be panic. Any reasonable person would scream, would beat against the walls, would beg for release or explanation or mercy. Myra had seen enough nature documentaries to know how captured animals behaved in zoos and laboratories, and she understood that her captors, whoever and whatever they were, probably expected the same from her. But Myra Chen was not an ordinary person, and she had not survived 3 years alone on the most isolated research station in the solar system by surrendering to fear whenever things went wrong. Instead of screaming, she sat very still and let her breathing slow. She closed her eyes and counted to 10, then opened them again and began a systematic survey of everything around her. She cataloged the plants, noted the dimensions of her enclosure, studied the walls and the ceiling and the other habitats she could see in the distance. If she was being watched, and she was certain that she was, then her watchers would learn something about humans today. Not that they were weak or easily frightened, not that they collapsed under pressure, but that they were patient and clever and capable of understanding situations that should have been beyond their comprehension. She would not give them her fear, she would give them a puzzle instead. High above in the observation deck, a junior technician noticed something unusual in the behavioral readings from the new human specimen and flagged it for review. The creature was not panicking, not exploring frantically, not displaying any of the standard stress responses that the preserve had cataloged across 400 species and 11,000 cycles of operation. She was just sitting there, looking around with what appeared to be scientific interest, apparently thinking. The technician made a note in the file and moved on to other tasks. It was probably nothing, just a temporary anomaly that would resolve into normal patterns within a few cycles as the shock wore off and the reality of her situation became clear. But the anomaly did not resolve, it only grew stranger. And somewhere deep in the preserve, in the habitat they had built for a primitive creature from an unremarkable world, Myra Chen began to plan. The protocol had governed the Galactic Preserve for 11,000 cycles without exception, without modification, without any acknowledgement that it might be flawed. The Vareth who had created it were long dead, but their successors followed their guidelines with religious devotion, believing that the accumulated wisdom of millennia could not possibly be wrong. Every specimen underwent the same sequence of tests, regardless of their species or their world of origin. The protocol measured survival instinct through environmental manipulation, testing how creatures responded to threats both obvious and subtle. It measured intelligence through puzzle scenarios that required tool use, pattern recognition, and problem-solving under increasing levels of stress. It measured aggression through carefully calibrated provocations, designed to reveal the violent potential that the Vareth believed lurked within every primitive species. The data from these tests determined a species' galactic classification, a ranking system that the Vareth had developed long ago to categorize all sentient life in the universe. Tier 1 species were considered potential equals, worthy of contact and cooperation, though none had ever been discovered in all the cycles of the preserve's operation. Tier 10 species were deemed too dangerous or too primitive to be allowed continued existence, and their homeworlds were quietly sterilized before they could spread beyond their own solar systems. Humans, based on preliminary observations and biological scans, had been assigned a provisional Tier 7 classification. Sentient but unremarkable, neither threatening nor promising, destined to be forgotten in the archives alongside thousands of other mediocre species that had failed to impress their Verath evaluators. But the protocol required confirmation through testing, and so the tests began on the third day of Myra Chen's captivity. She woke that morning to find her habitat filled with a strange smell, something sharp and chemical that made her heart race and her muscles tense without any conscious decision on her part. Her breathing quickened, her pupils dilated, and every instinct in her body screamed that a predator was nearby and that she needed to run. There was no predator, of course. The smell was artificial, synthesized pheromone designed to trigger exactly the fear response she was experiencing. The Verath had mapped the chemical signatures that indicated danger to hundreds of species, and they had learned to manufacture compounds that could make any creature feel hunted. But Myra was a scientist, and she recognized what was happening even as her body struggled against the chemical assault. She understood that her captors were testing her, probing for weaknesses, measuring how quickly and completely she surrendered to artificial fear. For several minutes, she simply sat with her back against a tree and forced herself to breathe slowly. She counted her heartbeats, acknowledged the fear without letting it control her, and waited for her rational mind to regain authority over her panicking body. The watchers wanted to see her run, wanted to see her hide, wanted to see her cower in terror from a threat she could not see or understand. Instead, she searched her habitat until she found a fallen branch thick enough to serve as a weapon, and then she sat in the open where she could see in all directions and waited with the patience of a predator herself. The pheromones faded after several hours, and nothing attacked. In the observation deck far above, a technician noted that the human had displayed an unexpected resistance to chemical fear induction and had responded with preparation rather than flight. The note was flagged for review but assigned low priority. Anomalies happened, and one unusual response did not change a classification. On the seventh day, the temperature in her habitat dropped without warning. The artificial sun continued to shine with the same cheerful brightness, but the air grew cold enough that frost began to form on the synthetic grass, and Myra could see her breath misting before her face in white clouds that dissipated into the frigid air. The temperature fell and fell, dropping past the point of discomfort into genuine danger. She had no clothing beyond the simple garment she had woken in, no blankets, no shelter beyond the inadequate cover of the artificial trees. A human body could not survive long in such conditions, and the protocol predicted that she would either enter a state of helpless distress or attempt to conserve heat through minimal movement while waiting for rescue that would never come. Instead, Myra began to gather materials with methodical efficiency. The synthetic bark of the trees had been designed to look realistic, not to function like real wood, but Myra discovered through patient experimentation that it would peel away in long strips if she applied enough force at the right angles. The strips were fibrous, almost like cloth, and she wove them together into a rough blanket that she wrapped around her shoulders for insulation. But she was not finished. She gathered dried grass and piled it into a nest, then searched the area around the pond until she found 2 stones that had enough mineral content to create sparks when struck together. The Verath botanists had designed the habitat materials to be fireproof, believing that no primitive creature would be able to generate sufficient heat to cause problems. But they had not anticipated that a human scientist would understand chemistry well enough to identify the exceptions to their careful engineering. Within 3 hours of the temperature drop, Myra Chen had built a small fire and was sitting beside it with her bark blanket wrapped around her shoulders, warming her hands and watching the flames dance with something that might have been satisfaction. In the observation deck, Commander Ixel-7 reviewed the footage personally and felt something unfamiliar stir in their chest. Not quite concern, not quite respect, but certainly more than the casual disinterest they had felt when the specimen first arrived. She should not have been able to do that, the commander said to the senior researcher beside them, their skin shifting to a color that indicated confusion. The habitat materials were specifically engineered to prevent combustion. Our botanists assured us that fire was impossible in that environment. She found a workaround, the researcher replied, and their voice carried a note of reluctant admiration that surprised them both. The mineral composition of the decorative stones near the pond was close enough to flint that she was able to generate sufficient heat to ignite the dried organic matter. It appears she has knowledge of chemistry and materials science beyond what we expected from her species. The tests continued over the following days, each one designed to probe a different aspect of the human's capabilities and limitations. They subjected her to pain stimuli of various kinds, sonic frequencies that caused splitting headaches, lights that flickered at rates designed to trigger migraines, vibrations in the floor that made her bones ache and her teeth rattle. She endured all of it without screaming, without begging, without any display of weakness beyond the physical symptoms she could not control. She simply sat and breathed and waited for each torment to end, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. They offered her comfort in exchange for submission, a warm bed that appeared in her habitat one morning with a simple collar beside it, the implicit message clear to any intelligent creature. The collar was not locked, not threatening in any obvious way, but its presence sent an unmistakable signal. Submit and be rewarded, resist and suffer. Myra looked at the collar for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she picked up the bed, carried it to the edge of the pond, and pushed it into the water. She slept on the ground that night and every night after, and she never touched the collar again. They withheld food for 12 full cycles, watching to see how hunger would affect her behavior and her cognition. By the 5th day she was clearly weak, her movements slower and less coordinated, her time spent resting rather than exploring. But she did not cry or plead or show any sign of giving up. Instead, she spent her waking hours studying the small creatures that the Vareth had placed in her habitat for atmospheric purposes. Insects and birds designed to make the environment feel more natural and alive. On the 13th day of the starvation test, the observation team noticed that one of their monitoring drones was missing. It had been disguised as a small songbird, equipped with cameras and sensors, and programmed to fly natural patterns around the habitat while recording everything the human did. Now it was gone, vanished without any alert from its tracking systems, and when they searched the archived footage they found the moment of its capture. The human had waited with absolute stillness until the bird landed within arm's reach, moving so little that the drone's motion sensors had not registered her as a threat. Then she struck with a speed that seemed impossible for her weakened condition, her hand closing around the mechanical creature before it could take flight. The drone's signal came from inside her shelter, a small structure she had built from branches and bark, and the thermal imaging showed her hunched over something with her body blocking the view. When she finally emerged, her hands were stained with the synthetic lubricants that served as the drone's equivalent of blood, and she was chewing slowly on something that was definitely not food. She had eaten their surveillance device, stripping it for any components that might provide nutrition or useful materials, and she had done it while staring directly at the observation window, the window that was supposed to be invisible, shielded by technology far beyond human understanding. She knew she was being watched, she had known all along. Commander Ixil-7 called an emergency review meeting, something that had not happened in the preserve for over 200 cycles. The preliminary Tier 7 classification was suspended pending further evaluation, and the human specimen was upgraded to Priority 1 observation status. "What are we dealing with here?" one of the council observers asked, their voice carrying notes of genuine confusion and perhaps the first stirrings of unease. This creature was supposed to be primitive, barely above the threshold for sentience, and yet she has defeated every test we have applied. The preliminary assessments may have been significantly flawed, Ixil-7 admitted, and the words felt strange and uncomfortable in their mouth. "She is more intelligent than our probes indicated, more resilient than her biology should allow, more adaptable than any Tier 7 species we have ever encountered in all the cycles of this preserve's operation." "Then what is she?" the observer demanded. The commander looked at the screens showing the human in her habitat, sitting peacefully beside her impossible fire as if nothing unusual had happened, and realized that they did not have an answer that satisfied the question. "I do not know," Ixil-7 said finally, "but I intend to find out. Prepare the next phase of testing. We will introduce a secondary specimen and observe her social behaviors." And in her habitat far below, Myra Chen looked up at the sky she knew was fake and allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. They thought they were testing her, learning her weaknesses, cataloging her limitations. But she was learning too, gathering information with every challenge they presented, building a picture of her captors through their methods and their mistakes. She did not know how, and she did not know when, but she was certain of one thing: she would not remain a specimen forever. The final phase of standard protocol required introducing a second specimen into the habitat to observe social dynamics. This was perhaps the most important test of all, for it revealed how a species treated others when resources were limited and competition was inevitable. The Vayreth believed that the true nature of any creature could only be understood by watching how it behaved toward those weaker than itself. In 11,000 cycles of testing across 400 species, the Vayreth had observed only 3 patterns of behavior: dominance, in which the stronger specimen established control over the weaker through intimidation or violence; competition, in which both specimens fought for resources until one surrendered or died; and isolation, in which both specimens ignored each other entirely and existed as separate entities sharing the same space but forming no connection. These patterns held true across every species, every culture, every level of technological development that the preserve had ever studied. It did not matter if the specimens came from peaceful civilizations or warlike ones, from worlds of plenty or worlds of desperate scarcity. When placed in a confined environment with limited resources, all sentient creatures eventually revealed their fundamental nature as selfish beings concerned primarily with their own survival. The Vayreth selected the secondary specimen with care. They wanted a creature that would test the human's social responses without endangering her, something weak enough that she would feel no need for caution, but sentient enough that her treatment of it would be meaningful. They chose a juvenile Corvith. The Corvith were a species the preserve had classified as Tier 3 600 cycles ago, sentient and capable of simple tool use, but primitive and easily frightened, with no significant potential for advancement beyond their current state. They resembled something between a small bear and a large rabbit in Earth terms, with soft golden fur covering their bodies and large dark eyes that seemed perpetually startled by the universe around them. This particular juvenile had been in the preserve for 6 cycles, taken from its homeworld during a routine collection expedition when it wandered too far from its family group. In that time, it had stopped eating properly, stopped responding to stimuli, stopped doing anything except sitting in corners and rocking back and forth in a motion that the Vayreth researchers had classified as a primitive self-soothing behavior. It was damaged, they knew. The stress of captivity had broken something inside it, some essential spark of life that allowed creatures to engage with the world around them. It would likely not survive many more cycles without intervention, and the Vayreth had decided that intervention was not worth the resources required. But it was still useful for testing purposes. And so they transferred it to the human's habitat during the night cycle while Myra slept. She woke to the sound of something crying. It was not a sound she recognized, not quite a whimper, not quite a moan, but something between them that spoke of deep and terrible distress. The sound was high and thin and desperate, the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to some ancient part of the brain that understood suffering without needing translation. Myra sat up slowly, her body tense and ready for danger, and scanned her habitat until she found the source of the heartbreaking noise. There, in the far corner where the artificial trees grew thickest, was a small creature curled into a tight ball with its arms wrapped around its knees. It was shaking violently, and the sounds coming from its throat were the most heartbreaking thing Myra had ever heard. Raw grief and terror and loneliness all mixed together into a single endless cry. Her first instinct was to approach immediately, to offer comfort, to do something, anything, to ease the obvious suffering she was witnessing. But she forced herself to stop and think before acting. This was clearly another test. Her captors had placed this creature here deliberately, watching to see what she would do. What did they expect from her? Competition, probably. They would expect her to see the newcomer as a threat to her limited resources, as a rival for food and water and space. Or perhaps they expected dominance, for her to establish herself as the superior being and force the smaller creature into submission through intimidation or violence. Myra looked at the trembling creature and felt something shift in her chest, some deep and fundamental response that had nothing to do with tests or captors or survival strategies. She saw a child in pain, alone and terrified, and nothing else mattered. She did not care what her captors expected. She did not care what their tests were designed to measure. She did not care about anything except the simple fact that there was a frightened child in front of her, and she could not bear to do nothing while it suffered. But she was also smart enough to know that rushing forward would only frighten it more. Whatever this creature was, whatever world it came from, it had clearly been traumatized by its experiences here, and sudden movements from a strange being would not help. So instead of approaching, she sat down where she was and made herself as small and non-threatening as possible. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, mirroring the creature's posture, and she began to hum. The melody was nothing special, just a lullaby her mother had sung to her when she was small, wordless and gentle, and designed to soothe. She did not know if the creature could hear it, did not know if the sounds would translate across the vast gulf between their species and their worlds, but she hummed anyway because it was all she could think to do. The crying continued for a long time, hours passing while Myra sat and hummed and waited with a patience that came not from training but from something deeper, some instinct that told her this was the right thing to do, that this was what it meant to be human. After several hours, the creature's shaking began to slow. The next day, Myra placed half of her food ration, already small after the extended deprivation test, in a spot between them and retreated to the far side of the habitat. She did not look at the creature, did not make any gesture that might seem aggressive or demanding, simply left the offering and went about her day as if nothing unusual had happened. The creature did not take the food that day or the next, but on the third day Myra woke to find the portion gone and a small mark scratched in the dirt where it had been, a mark that might have been accidental, or might have been a message, or might have been nothing at all. She chose to believe it was a thank you. Days passed and Myra learned. She learned that the creature made different sounds for different emotional states, high chirps when it was startled, low rumbles when it was calm, that terrible keening when the fear became too much to bear. She learned to mimic these sounds as best her human throat could manage, answering its distress calls with soft noises that seemed to communicate something like, "I am here, you are safe, you are not alone." She fashioned a small blanket from the bark strips she had learned to weave and left it in the spot where the creature slept. The next morning, the blanket had been moved to a new location, and the creature was curled beneath it with something that might have been peace on its face. On the 8th day, something miraculous happened. Myra was sitting by her fire, cooking a small portion of the rations that had resumed after the starvation test ended, when she heard movement behind her. She did not turn, did not react, simply continued what she was doing as if nothing unusual was occurring. Soft footsteps approached, hesitant and ready to flee at the slightest provocation. She could hear breathing now, quick and nervous, and she focused on keeping her own breath slow and steady. Then, with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears, a small furry body settled onto the ground beside her. She still did not look, did not move, did not do anything that might break the spell of this moment. She simply continued cooking, and when the food was ready, she placed a portion beside her without comment. The creature ate, and Myra felt something warm spread through her chest. By the 12th day, it was sleeping pressed against her side every night, its soft fur warm against her skin, and its breathing deep with something that might have been peace. Myra had named it in her mind, not a real name, but a sound she made that it seemed to respond to, something like pip, for the small happy sounds it made when content. And then the Veyrath sent the predator. It came without warning during the night cycle, a machine designed to look like a carnivore, with gleaming metal teeth and red sensor eyes and claws that could tear through synthetic bark like paper. It crashed through the artificial trees with a roar that shook the ground beneath them, and Pip woke screaming. The test was designed to trigger flight or fight responses, to see whether the human would abandon the useless creature or try to use it as a distraction while she escaped. Every species they had ever tested had chosen self-preservation when faced with genuine threat, and the researchers expected no different outcome here. But Myra did not run, and she did not sacrifice her small companion. Instead, she pushed Pip behind her, placing her fragile human body between the child and the machine, and she picked up a stone from beside the fire with her free hand. Her eyes were wide with fear. She was not foolish enough to feel no terror, but her hands were steady, and her voice was clear as she shouted words the creature could not understand. "You want to see what a human is made of?" She screamed at the sky she knew was false, at the watchers she knew were there. "Then watch this." She fought with everything she had. The machine was stronger, faster, better armed in every possible way. But Myra Chen had spent 3 years surviving alone on a hostile moon where everything wanted to kill her, and she had learned that survival was not about winning fights but about refusing to lose. She dodged and struck and dodged again, and when the machine's claws tore into her arm, she did not stop, did not retreat, did not give 1 inch of ground between the predator and the child behind her. In the observation deck, the researchers watched with something that might have been horror. Her biological readings showed pain beyond what most species could endure, fear hormones flooding her system at levels that should have triggered complete psychological shutdown. And still she fought. "Deactivate it," Commander Ixel-7 ordered, their voice strange and quiet in a way that made the other researchers turn to stare. "But the test protocol requires." "Deactivate it now." The machine froze mid-strike, its claws centimeters from Myra's face. She stood there panting, bleeding, trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. And then she turned her back on the predator without hesitation and knelt beside Pip, gathering the small creature into her arms and making soft sounds that meant, safe now, I have you, I will not let anything hurt you." The child clung to her and would not let go, and Myra held it tight and did not care about her wounds or her fear or anything, except this small, terrified being who needed her. Ixel-7 stared at the screens showing the human rocking the alien creature in her arms, blood dripping from wounds she had earned protecting a being that was nothing to her, not her species, not her family, not her world, not even capable of understanding her language or her sacrifice. "Why?" the commander asked, though no one in the observation deck could answer. Why would she do this? There was no classification code for what they had witnessed. There was no protocol for recording an act of pure, irrational, magnificent love. For the first time in 3 centuries of faithful service, Ixel-7 did not know what to write in the report. Commander Ixel-7 had served the Galactic Preserve for 347 cycles of unwavering dedication. In that time, they had overseen the testing and classification of 63 species, had watched countless specimens live and die within the sterile walls of their habitats, had written reports that sometimes determined whether entire worlds would be allowed to continue existing or would be quietly sterilized before their inhabitants could spread beyond their home systems. They had always believed in the work with complete and unquestioning faith. The protocol was necessary, they told themselves, because the galaxy was dangerous, and the Vareth had a sacred responsibility to understand the nature of other species before deciding how to interact with them. Some civilizations were too violent to be allowed spaceflight. Some were too unstable to be trusted with advanced technology. Some were simply too primitive to warrant the effort of meaningful contact. The preserve was not cruel. It was careful. It was scientific. It was the rational response to a universe filled with unknown dangers and unpredictable species that might threaten the safety of all civilized beings. But now, standing alone in the observation deck long after the other researchers had departed to their rest cycles, Ixil-7 looked at the footage from the human habitat and felt something crack inside the certainty they had carried for 3 centuries. The human was sleeping now, her wounds bandaged with strips torn from her own clothing, because the Vareth had not thought to provide medical supplies. The Corvith child was curled against her chest, its small body rising and falling with each breath, and even in sleep it clung to her as if letting go would mean being lost forever in a universe that had shown it nothing but cruelty. She had protected it. She had bled for it. She had been willing to die for a creature that was nothing to her, that offered her nothing, that could not even thank her in words she would understand. Why? The question burned in Ixil-7's mind as they returned to their private quarters and began accessing files that had not been reviewed in centuries. The observation probes sent to Earth, the long-distance monitoring data collected over generations, the reports that previous researchers had filed and then forgotten because the species was deemed unimportant. What they found made them stop breathing. The humans kept other species in their homes, not as food, not as labor, not for any practical purpose that the Vareth could identify. They called these creatures pets and treated them as family members, feeding them before they fed themselves, providing them with medical care that sometimes cost more than the creatures were economically worth, grieving when they died as if they had lost a part of their own souls. The humans built structures specifically designed to protect creatures that had no value to their civilization. They called these structures shelters and sanctuaries and preserves. The last word made Ixil-7 feel something cold and heavy settle in their stomach, a realization forming that they did not want to acknowledge. The humans rushed into burning buildings to save strangers. They donated organs to beings they had never met and would never meet again. They traveled across their world to provide aid after disasters, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of having helped. Their soldiers fell on explosives to save their companions. Their parents worked themselves to exhaustion for their children. Their communities gathered around those in need with offerings of food and shelter and simple presents. Their literature was filled with stories of sacrifice, of heroes who gave their lives for others, of ordinary people who chose compassion over self-interest again and again, even when that choice cost them everything. And the Vareth had classified them as Tier 7, minimal threat, minimal interest, barely worth studying. Ixil-7 pulled up the master database and began reviewing the protocols that governed the preserve. They read them with new eyes now, seeing patterns they had never noticed before, or perhaps had simply chosen not to see because seeing them would have required uncomfortable questions. Every test was designed to measure weakness, to find breaking points, to catalog the ways in which species failed under pressure. The survival scenarios tested how quickly specimens surrendered to fear. The intelligence puzzles tested how efficiently they used others as tools or obstacles. The social dynamics tests measured how readily they would betray or abandon their companions when resources became scarce. The protocol did not ask whether a species would help others. It asked only how they would harm them. It did not measure kindness or compassion or sacrifice. It measured only selfishness and cruelty and the capacity for violence. And for 11,000 cycles, the Vareth had watched specimen after specimen confirm their expectations. Creatures chose themselves over others, chose dominance over cooperation, chose cruelty over kindness. The tests proved, again and again, that all species were fundamentally selfish, fundamentally violent, fundamentally untrustworthy. But now Ixil-7 understood what they had actually proven. They had created conditions designed to reward selfishness and punish compassion, and then they had used the results to justify their belief that selfishness was universal. They had built a machine for manufacturing evidence of cruelty, and they had convinced themselves that the evidence was natural. The tests were not revealing the nature of the species they collected. They were revealing the nature of the Vareth themselves. The commander requested a meeting with the Consortium High Council, the first such request from any staff member in over 3,000 cycles. The council was the governing body of the preserve, 12 ancient Vareth who had overseen its operation since before Ixil-7 was born, and they were not accustomed to being summoned by subordinates for anything less than emergencies. They gathered in the Grand Chamber, a space specifically designed to intimidate visitors with its vast emptiness and cold lighting. Ixil-7 stood before them feeling smaller than they had ever felt in their long life, knowing that what they were about to say could end their career or perhaps even their existence. "The human does not fit our models," Ixil-7 began, projecting the footage from the habitat onto the chamber's display screens. "I have brought you here to explain why this matters more than anything we have encountered in 11,000 cycles." The council watched with expressions of polite disinterest as the images played, the human building her fire from materials that should have been impossible to ignite, enduring the pain tests without breaking, sharing her food with the Corvith child when she herself was starving, fighting the predator machine with nothing but a stone and her determination to protect a creature that was not her own. "One specimen means nothing," a council member said when the footage ended, their tone dismissive. "Anomalies occur in any sufficiently large dataset. Statistical outliers are to be expected across a sufficient sample size." "This is not an anomaly," Ixil-7 replied, and their voice was stronger than they had expected it to be. "I have reviewed the observation data from Earth, data that has been collected for centuries and largely ignored because the species was deemed unimportant." They projected new footage now. Humans rescuing strangers from floods at risk to their own lives. Humans feeding wild animals in winter. Humans protesting against cruelty to creatures they would never meet and could never benefit from protecting. Humans crying over the deaths of beings that were not their own kind and could not even understand the grief being offered. "They do this constantly," Ixil-7 said. "Not as exceptions, not as statistical outliers, but as a fundamental pattern of their behavior that appears across their entire civilization and throughout their recorded history. They have built their entire society around the concept of extending compassion beyond their own immediate family, beyond their own tribe, beyond their own species." The council shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not the kind of data they were accustomed to reviewing. And they did not have categories in their classification system for the patterns Ixil-7 was describing. "What is your point?" the senior council member demanded, their patience clearly wearing thin. "If the humans are more altruistic than expected, we will simply adjust their classification accordingly." "My point," Ixil-7 said slowly, choosing each word with care, "is that we have been asking the wrong questions for 11,000 cycles." The silence that followed was absolute. "We built a system to measure how species respond to fear and scarcity, and the presence of the weak," the commander continued, their voice growing stronger with each sentence. "We created tests that rewarded selfishness and punished cooperation. And then we used the results to rank species, to decide which worlds would be contacted and which would be sterilized, to pass judgment on civilizations based on how well they performed under conditions designed to bring out the worst in any sentient being. We told ourselves we were being objective, being scientific, being careful, but we were not measuring the nature of other species. We were measuring how effectively we could break them. The council members were starring now, some with anger written clearly on their faces, and some with something that might have been the first flickering of understanding. The human should have failed every test we designed, HFY said, their voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. She was alone, frightened, hungry, in pain. Every pressure we applied should have pushed her toward selfishness, toward cruelty, toward the patterns we expected to find. But instead, she chose compassion. She chose to protect a creature that was nothing to her. She chose to be kind when kindness cost her blood. And that means the test was never measuring what we thought it measured. HFY took a deep breath and spoke the words they had been building toward since they began reviewing the files in the darkness of their quarters. For 11,000 cycles, we have been running an experiment on the species we collected, but we have also been running an experiment on ourselves. Every time we watched a specimen suffer and did nothing to help, every time we inflicted pain in the name of science, every time we made decisions about which worlds deserved to exist based on how well their inhabitants responded to torture, we were being tested too. We thought we were the observers, but the universe has been observing us as well. And we have been failing. We have been failing for 11,000 years. The words echoed in the vast chamber, bouncing off walls that had never heard such accusations, and no one spoke. The council members looked at each other, looked at the screens still showing the human holding the Corvith child, looked at the commander who had just shattered everything they believed about their life's work. The senior council member finally broke the silence, and their voice was smaller and older than HFY had ever heard it. "What would you have us do?" they asked. The commander looked at the image of the sleeping human, at the peace on her face, despite everything she had endured, at the child in her arms who had found safety and love in the most unlikely of places. "I would have us learn from her," HFY said. "I would have us become the species we always claimed we were, wise and careful and concerned with the well-being of all. I would have us start by admitting what we have done wrong, and then doing better." The council adjourned to deliberate, and they would argue for 9 cycles before reaching a decision. The vote would be narrow and contested and unprecedented in the long history of the Verath. But the first crack had formed in the certainty of 11,000 years, and through that crack something like hope was beginning to shine. The council deliberated for 9 cycles, and during that time the Galactic Preserve continued its operations as if nothing had changed. Specimens were fed and monitored according to schedule. Tests were conducted following the protocols that had governed the facility for millennia. Reports were filed and archived in databases that stretched back 11,000 cycles. But something was different now, something subtle and impossible to quantify, something that spread through the staff like a quiet infection of doubt and wonder. Word of HFY's presentation had leaked despite all efforts to contain it. The commander had spoken to too many subordinates while gathering data, had accessed too many files that required explanation, had asked too many questions that could not be unasked. Researchers who had spent their careers measuring fear responses and cataloging suffering found themselves watching their specimens differently, seeing not data points but individuals, not subjects but prisoners, not objects of study but beings who might have families somewhere missing them. Some rejected the new perspective violently, insisting that the protocol was correct and the human was simply an aberration that would eventually conform to expected patterns like every other species before her. They clung to their certainty with desperate intensity because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The alternative meant that everything they had done for centuries had been wrong. But others began pulling their own records, reviewing their own footage, asking their own uncomfortable questions about what they had really been doing all these cycles. They watched old recordings of specimens crying out in fear and loneliness, and for the first time, they wondered if those sounds might mean something more than data. And in her habitat far below the observation decks and deliberation chambers, Myra Chen had no idea that her simple act of kindness had started a revolution. She knew only that the tests had stopped, that no new challenges had been introduced, that her wounds were healing slowly but steadily without infection. She knew that Pip, the name had become permanent in her mind, a small defiance against the clinical numbness of their captivity, was finally beginning to thrive. The creature had learned to trust her completely now, following her around the habitat during the day and sleeping curled against her side at night. It no longer rocked in corners or made those terrible sounds of despair that had broken Myra's heart when they first met. Instead, Pip made happy chirping sounds when Myra approached, made low rumbles of contentment when she stroked its fur, made excited squeaks when she suggested a game. She had taught Pip to play, tossing a ball made of woven bark and watching the child chase it with an enthusiasm that made her chest swell with something she could only call love. She had learned that Pip loved being brushed, that it would bring her small gifts, interesting stones and colorful leaves, and once a flower from the artificial garden, and present them with obvious pride and joy. They had developed a language of their own, a mixture of sounds and gestures and expressions that let them communicate basic concepts and emotions. They could tell each other hungry and tired and safe, and something that might have been happy or might have been love. Mira was not sure there was a difference anymore. When the council's vote was finally announced, Commander Ixel-7 came to the habitat personally to deliver the news. The commander looked different than Myra remembered from the glimpses she had caught through the observation windows, older somehow, or perhaps just tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. The council had decided, by the narrowest possible margin, that the Galactic Preserve would close. Not immediately. Such a monumental change required careful planning, demanded consideration of the hundreds of species currently housed within its walls, necessitated negotiations with worlds and governments across the galaxy. But the process would begin, and it would not be reversed no matter how much some members of the consortium might wish otherwise. The protocol would be abandoned, the classification system would be dismantled piece by piece, and the Vareth would begin the long and painful work of undoing 11,000 cycles of accumulated cruelty. Myra listened through the transparent wall as Ixel-7 explained what was happening, speaking slowly and clearly in a language that had been translated by machines until it was almost understandable. She heard words like unprecedented and fundamental change. And because of you, and she felt something shift in her chest that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of tears. We are offering all specimens a choice, Ixel-7 said, their voice carrying a weight that suggested they understood how inadequate any offer could be after what had been done. Those whose homeworlds can support them will be returned if they wish it, with whatever assistance we can provide to ease their transition. Those whose worlds are too changed or too dangerous will be given habitat planets, monitored for their safety but not confined, free to live as they choose. And what about me? Myra asked, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. The commander paused, and in that pause Myra saw something she had not expected from any of her captors. Uncertainty, perhaps even something like shame. You are offered the same choice as any other being we have wronged, Ixel-7 said finally. You may return to Earth with your memories intact, free to tell your people what happened here or to keep it secret as you prefer. Or you may remain in a different capacity, not as a specimen, not as a prisoner, but as a liaison between your species and ours. An ambassador, Myra asked, and the word felt strange on her tongue, too formal for what had happened between them, too diplomatic for the blood and fear and love that had brought them to this moment. If that is what you wish to call it, Ixil-7 replied. "We have much to learn from your kind, more than I ever imagined possible, and someone must help us understand what we have been missing for so long." Myra thought about Earth. She thought about the blue sky and real grass and the sound of rain on windows, about the smell of coffee and the feel of a book in her hands, about all the small, ordinary pleasures she had taken for granted before she woke up in this sterile prison. She thought about her colleagues at the Europa station who must think she was dead by now, about her family who had probably held a funeral and tried to move on with their lives. And she thought about Pip, who was pressing against her leg and making small, worried sounds, as if sensing that something important was being decided, who had survived 6 cycles of captivity and loneliness before Myra arrived, who had found something like a family in the most unlikely place in the universe. "I will stay," Myra said, and her voice did not waver, but only on one condition. "Name it," the commander said. Myra looked down at Pip, at the large dark eyes looking up at her with complete trust and something that might have been love, and she smiled. "Pip stays with me. Whatever happens, wherever I go, whatever role I play in this new future you are building, we stay together." The condition was granted without debate, without hesitation, without any of the careful calculation that had characterized every Veyrath decision for millennia. What else could they say to the creature who had shown them their own failure, who had taught them with blood and kindness what 11,000 cycles of study had missed? The cycles that followed were strange and difficult, and sometimes painful for everyone involved. The preserve transformed slowly, its sterile corridors filling with movement and noise as species that had been isolated for generations were finally allowed to interact and form connections. Some specimens could not adjust, too traumatized by their years of captivity, too damaged by the tests that had been designed to break them. And Myra found herself spending long hours with these broken beings, offering comfort and patience and the simple promise that things would get better. She became, without meaning to or seeking it, something like a healer. She had no training for it, no qualifications beyond her own stubbornness, nothing but her refusal to accept that any creature was beyond help. But somehow that was enough, and one by one the broken specimens began to emerge from their shells and remember what it felt like to be alive. Ixil-7 visited her often, at first for official reasons, reports to review, questions to answer, protocols to establish for this new and uncertain way of doing things. But eventually the visits became less official and more personal. The commander, who had spent 3 centuries cataloging the weaknesses of lesser species, now found themselves sitting outside Myra's habitat for hours, just listening to her talk about nothing in particular while Pip played in the artificial grass. "Why did you do it?" Ixil-7 asked one day, the question that had haunted them since the moment they watched Myra fight the predator machine. "You could have run. You could have let us take the child. You could have saved yourself and no one would have blamed you, not even me." Myra thought about the question for a long moment before answering, searching for words that could bridge the vast gulf between human hearts and Veyrath minds. "Because I could not have lived with myself if I had done those things," she said finally. "Not because I am brave or special or better than anyone else. Just because the thought of abandoning Pip made me feel sick in a way that dying did not." "I do not understand," Ixil-7 admitted. "I know," Myra said gently, reaching out to touch the commander's arm in a gesture that would have been unthinkable cycles ago. "But maybe that is what I am here to teach you." On the anniversary of Myra's capture, now celebrated as something like a holiday among the former specimens, Ixil-7 found her in her habitat teaching Pip to sing. The Corvith child did not have the vocal structure for human melodies, and the sounds it produced were nothing like the songs Myra remembered from Earth. But they were trying, both of them, reaching across an impossible gap between species and worlds to create something neither of them could have made alone. The melody was imperfect, the words meant nothing. Half the notes were wrong and the other half were barely recognizable as music. But they were laughing, and the sound filled the habitat and spilled out into the corridors beyond, and everywhere it reached it carried something that had never existed in the galactic preserve before. Not fear, not despair, not the cold efficiency of scientific observation, but joy. Ixil-7 stood outside the transparent wall and listened, and for the first time in their long life felt something wet track down their face. They did not know what the sensation was. Their species did not cry, had never had reason to develop such a response. But they suspected Myra would be able to explain it when they found the courage to ask. Later, the commander returned to their quarters and opened the human file that had caused so much upheaval. The classification field still showed the old preliminary assessment, Tier 7, a judgment that now seemed almost laughably wrong. Ixil-7 deleted it with a single gesture and sat for a long time staring at the empty space. In its place, they wrote the first subjective annotation in preserve history, words that no protocol had ever required, that no council had ever demanded, that came from somewhere deep inside that had not existed before a human taught them it could. Tier classification, unassignable, they wrote. This species does not fit our models because our models were wrong from the beginning. Humans are not stronger than us, or smarter than us, or more advanced than us in any way we traditionally measure. They are fragile, short-lived, limited in ways we once thought significant. But they have something we lacked for 11,000 cycles, something that makes all our strength and intelligence and advancement meaningless in comparison. They know how to love things that are not themselves. Recommendation: learn from them. Not as subjects, not as specimens, not as data to be cataloged and filed, but as teachers, as examples, as the beings who finally showed us what we had been missing all along. We built a zoo to study the universe and judge its inhabitants, but the universe sent us a human to study us and teach us that judgment was never ours to make. And in the end, she was the one who set us free. Ixil-7 saved the file and closed the display. Outside their window, the stars shone cold and distant as they always had. But somehow, tonight, they seemed full of possibilities that had never existed before. And far away in a habitat that was no longer a prison, a human and an alien child curled up together and slept the peaceful sleep of beings who had found, against all odds and across all the distances of space and species, exactly where they belonged. The Galactic Zoo had tested one human, and the creatures who built it had failed. But in their failure, they had finally found the chance to become something better. And that, Myra would have said if anyone asked her, was the most human thing of all.